Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. The fog lay thick upon Baker Street that evening, curling about the gas lamps like a living thing. The distant clip-clop of hansom cabs echoed faintly, muffled by the damp air, while a thin drizzle traced lazy patterns upon the window pane. I sat close to the hearth, attempting to read a monograph on cranial fractures, but my attention was repeatedly drawn to my companion, Sherlock Holmes. There was something peculiar in his manner, a restlessness that neither pipe nor Persian slipper could abate. Twice he sprang from his chair to consult a volume upon the shelf, only to cast it aside with a sigh of dissatisfaction. I knew the signs well enough. Holmes was starving for a case, and the stillness of the evening was, to him, a torment. It was in such hours that fate, or perhaps some darker providence, invariably brought a knock to our door. Holmes had occupied himself, for the better part of the hour, in the peculiar habit of firing questions at me. Unrelated inquiries about botanical toxins, obscure monastic orders, and the precise year in which a comet had appeared above London. Each question came as suddenly as a gunshot, then left hanging in silence before I could answer. His fingers drummed against the arm of his chair with increasing impatience, while his sharp grey eyes flickered between the window and the mantelpiece, as though searching for something unseen. "I would welcome even the theft of a postman's bicycle at this point," he muttered. "Perhaps a quiet evening is a blessing," I ventured. Holmes turned to me with a look of faint amusement, that thin smile which always suggested my words had only confirmed his own suspicions. "Quiet evenings, Watson, are nothing but preludes to louder visitors." As if summoned by his words, a sudden rap, rap, rap rang from the door below. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps, slow and measured, followed, then the sound of low voices exchanging hurried words. A moment later, our door creaked open, and there stood a man of middle years, heavily cloaked, his shoulders hunched against the chill, his gloved hands clasped before him like a supplicant. He entered the room with an air of furtive unease, his gaze darting toward the shadowed corners before settling, almost reluctantly, upon Holmes. His lips moved, but no words emerged at first, only a thin wheeze, as if the very act of speaking required courage he did not possess. Holmes regarded him coolly, offering no invitation to sit. Instead, his keen gaze swept over the man, taking in every stain, crease and smudge upon his person, and the faintest glint of interest flickered in his eyes. "Surrey clay upon the boots," Holmes murmured, half to himself. "Ink upon the second finger of the left hand. Smudged, I see, suggesting hasty correspondence. And a button repaired by an amateur hand, almost certainly his own. A parish vicar, recently returned from a visit to some neighbouring village. And, if I am not mistaken, one given to spiritual experiments." The man's pale face flushed crimson. "You are correct, sir. Entirely correct." "Of course I am," Holmes replied dismissively. "Please sit, Reverend." "You have come about a ghost, I presume?" The man's trembling increased, and his voice cracked with emotion. "A ghost, yes. God help me, I have seen it with my own eyes." Holmes shot me a glance, half amusement, half curiosity. "Watson, it seems we have been blessed with a case after all. Let us hear it before it vanishes into the mist." The man who sat before us introduced himself in a voice that quavered between fear and formality. "Reverend Charles Netherby," he said, fingers twisting his hat with nervous energy. His thin frame and careworn face seemed at odds with the serene authority one expects of a country vicar. There was something almost apologetic in his every word, as though his very presence offended his own sense of propriety. Holmes, who had fixed him with that unwavering gaze of his, offered no reassurance, nor did he interrupt. He let the man stew in his discomfort a moment longer before speaking. "You are not accustomed to London, Reverend," Holmes observed. "The city weighs upon you." The Reverend gave a feeble nod, his anxiety growing by the second. "I would not have come," he whispered. "But what I have witnessed defies reason, and I feared no man but Mr. Holmes could explain it." With visible reluctance, Reverend Netherby began to recount his tale. A story that, had it come from any less dignified source, Holmes might have dismissed outright. According to the vicar, on the previous Thursday evening, he had entered the vestry of his small parish chapel to retrieve a forgotten sermon book. The candle he carried flickered in an unnatural draught, and no sooner had he stepped inside than a voice, thin, reedy, and unmistakably unearthly, whispered his name. He swore upon his very soul that a shape emerged from the wall, spectral and glowing, and spoke directly to him. The ghost, or whatever it was, claimed knowledge of a hidden document concealed within the chapel, a document that would finally reveal the truth behind a long unsolved disappearance that had haunted the parish for decades. "I have stood at the pulpit for 30 years, the Reverend said, voice shaking, "and never have I questioned the boundary between this world and the next, until now." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his expression unreadable. "Fascinating," he said, though the gleam in his eyes betrayed no belief in the supernatural. The Reverend continued, explaining that the incident had not remained private for long. The parish sexton, overhearing Netherby's distressed muttering the following morning, extracted the story from him, and within hours the tale spread through the village like wildfire. The reaction, Netherby said, was nothing short of a civil war among his flock. Half the parishioners declared him a man touched by divine visions, chosen to uncover some long-buried sacred truth. The other half whispered behind closed doors that their vicar had lost his wits, his mind worn thin by isolation and too many sermons delivered to empty pews. Holmes listened without comment, but I saw the slight twitch of his fingers, the familiar sign that his mind was already dissecting the story into cause and effect. "And what do you believe, Reverend?" Holmes asked at last. The vicar swallowed hard. "I believe what I saw. But whether it was ghost or trick of the mind, that, sir, I do not know." Holmes's fingers twitched again. I knew that gesture well. It meant he already had a theory, and that the Reverend's troubles were only just beginning. Holmes rose abruptly, circling the Reverend like a hawk sizing up a rabbit. His gaze flickered over Netherby's clothing, his hands, his boots, even the slight tilt of his posture. "You walked here from Charing Cross," Holmes said. "The mud on your boots is fresh, and of a particular yellowish hue only found near the station cab rank. The ink upon your fingers, Reverend, suggests frantic correspondence written in haste, possibly a plea for assistance before courage could fail you." Netherby opened his mouth to object, but Holmes raised a hand for silence. "Your left cuff shows a smear of candle wax, not yet entirely hardened. Proof you've spent your nights pacing the vestry, candle in hand, reliving what you saw. And the repair to your coat button, crude and uneven, suggests you were too distracted to summon a tailor, choosing instead to mend it yourself." I could not help but smile at the Reverend's astonishment. I had witnessed such displays many times, but for the unsuspecting client, Holmes's deductions struck like a thunderclap. "Ghosts," Holmes continued, "are rarely so careless as to leave mud, ink, and wax upon their visitors. You, sir, have encountered something quite human, though perhaps not entirely honest." The Reverend stammered his protests, but Holmes only waved him to continue his tale. "All truth reveals itself eventually, Reverend," he said, "even when dressed in a sheet." For all the gravity of the Reverend's account, Holmes could not resist a certain mordant amusement. "You must forgive me, Watson," he said, "but I find ghosts of the ecclesiastical variety particularly droll. They have, after all, the most fertile ground for haunting. Centuries of buried scandals and sermons rarely leave the walls entirely clean." I objected, reminding him that even the most sceptical man might find his reason shaken when confronted by a speaking apparition. "Apparition?" Holmes scoffed. My dear fellow, you and I have solved enough cases to know that a voice in the dark rarely comes unaccompanied by hidden wires, pipes, or a paid accomplice with a flair for the theatrical. He turned his attention back to the Reverend. This ghost of yours, sir, is no ethereal wanderer. It is, I would wager, a very earthly creature, driven by motives altogether more mundane than divine revelation. Though I found his levity somewhat cruel, I could not deny its logic. Holmes had long held that the supernatural was merely the natural cleverly disguised, and once again, it seemed he would have the chance to prove it. For all his jesting, I could see that Holmes was genuinely intrigued. His fingers had ceased their restless drumming, his posture sharpening into that unmistakable hunter's stillness that always signalled the scent of prey. "Reverend," Holmes said, "there is nothing that fascinates me more than a falsehood concealed within belief. Wherever faith clouds the senses, there is room for mischief, and mischief, as you may know, is my particular area of expertise." The Reverend appeared both relieved and somewhat bewildered by Holmes's sudden enthusiasm. "You will come, then? To the chapel?" "Naturally," Holmes replied. "There is nothing quite so instructive as a haunted vestry. Besides, I suspect your ghost has left behind traces far more tangible than you realize." He reached for his hat and coat, his mood already lifted by the promise of a puzzle worthy of his mind. "Come, Watson. It appears our quiet evening has vanished into the mist, much like the ghost itself." With that, we stepped into the fog once more, the Reverend trailing behind, his anxious breath rising like smoke into the chill night air. The following morning found Holmes and myself ensconced in the corner of a first-class railway carriage, bound for the sleepy village of Eversham. Holmes had offered little conversation, instead occupying himself with a pocket-sized monograph on medieval burial rites, which he read with the same sharp-eyed intensity he would give a murder scene. As for myself, I spent much of the journey musing over what it was that had so thoroughly ensnared Holmes's interest. The Reverend's tale, though unusual, seemed rather beneath Holmes's usual appetite for intellectual sport. Ghostly apparitions and the mutterings of a scandal-thirsty parish hardly compared to blackmailing kings or deciphering ancient ciphers. "Holmes," I ventured at last, "I confess I do not fully grasp why this case compels you." He closed the monograph with a snap. "My dear Watson, the more absurd the tale, the more certain we may be that a very real hand lurks behind it. Rational men rarely invent ghosts. They are invented for them, usually by scoundrels with very tangible aims." With that, he returned to his reading, leaving me to wonder what sort of scoundrel we were about to encounter in St. Jude's. The village of Eversham, when we arrived, lay under a pall of mist that seemed to cling to the very stones. Holmes led the way to St. Jude's, a modest chapel that stood at the village's edge, its ancient walls half obscured by creeping ivy and the weight of unsavoury legend. Even before we crossed the threshold, we encountered the first sign of the parish's divided loyalties. A pair of old farmers, locked in argument, stood by the gate, one insisting that the ghost was a divine warning, the other proclaiming it a fabrication designed to cover some earthly vice. Holmes listened briefly, then strode past without comment. Inside, the air was cold, the silence almost oppressive. The nave lay empty, save for the faint scent of damp stone and candle wax. "Charming," Holmes murmured, his voice echoing softly in the stillness. "Few places wear their guilt so plainly on their walls." He glanced toward the vestry door, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Come, Watson, the ghost awaits." We found the chapel's sexton, a bent-shouldered man named Abberline, polishing a brass candlestick near the altar. Holmes wasted no time. "You heard the Reverend's tale, of course," he said. "What do you make of it?" The sexton shifted uneasily, eyes flicking toward the vestry door. "The vicar's a good man, sir," he said, "but his imagination runs away with him sometimes." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "And you, Mr. Abberline, do you believe in ghosts?" The sexton gave a non-committal shrug. "A man sees things in old buildings, sir. Shadows move, walls remember, but ghosts who speak. He trailed off, shaking his head. Holmes's gaze sharpened. You knew the old churchwarden, did you not? The one who vanished all those years ago. Abeline's hand tightened on the candlestick. Long time ago that. Nothing to do with this nonsense, surely. Perhaps not, said Holmes. But ghosts, you see, are rarely interested in the present. They haunt us because of the past. The sexton offered no reply, but his fingers trembled slightly as he returned to his work. Holmes watched him for a moment longer, then turned toward the vestry, with the air of a man following a scent only he could detect. Holmes crossed into the vestry, his gaze sweeping the room with the practiced ease of a man who could read a crime scene like a printed page. I, in turn, attempted to emulate his method, though with considerably less success. To my eye, the room was unremarkable: a humble table, a few shelves bearing hymnals and ledgers, and a single candle, half burned, sitting beside the prayer book. Holmes, however, paused beside the table, fingers tracing a faint scorch mark on the floorboards. A candle overturned here, he murmured, recently, by the look of it. He lifted one of the hymnals, inspecting its spine. Displaced, the dust pattern betrays it. Someone moved this book, in a hurry. At the rear of the room, near the base of the wall, he knelt to examine a patch of freshly disturbed earth. And this, he said, tapping the floor lightly, tells me our ghost is rather more flesh and blood than Reverend Netherby would have us believe. What do you mean? I asked. But Holmes had already turned, his mind racing ahead of his words. There are threads here, Watson, old threads, leading backward through time. Let us see where they go. With that, he strode from the vestry, leaving me scrambling to follow, notebook in hand, and a growing sense that the ghost of St. Jude's was about to prove far less ethereal than legend would suggest. It was during a brief conversation with the village postmaster, an elderly man with a remarkable memory for local scandal, that I first heard the tale of Elias Weatherbe, the chapel's former warden. Weatherbe had disappeared some 30 years prior, leaving behind nothing but rumour and suspicion. It was whispered that funds collected for the chapel's roof repair had vanished alongside him. The matter might have been forgotten had it not been for the added spice of forbidden romance. For Weatherbe had been seen, more than once, walking alone with a young woman of ill repute, a laundress known for her charm and her misfortune in choosing companions. Some claimed he had fled with her to London, others that he had taken his own life, unable to face the shame. The vestry, where Weatherbe was last seen, had gained a dark reputation, and superstitious whispers had long attached his restless spirit to the chapel's stones. I relayed these details to Holmes as we walked back across the churchyard. He listened in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, and when I had finished, he gave no response at all, merely quickened his pace, as if my words had confirmed something only he had suspected. Holmes led me directly into the vestry, where the parish ledgers were kept in a cabinet near the window. Without pause, he drew one from the shelf and began flipping through the yellowed pages with astonishing speed, his eyes flicking left to right with predatory focus. "What exactly are you looking for?" I asked, watching the pages flutter under his fingers. "The hand that feared the truth," he said cryptically. Suddenly he stopped, his finger resting lightly upon an incomplete entry, a donation recorded in Weatherbe's own hand, its amount uncharacteristically large, but more notably, its entry cut off mid-sentence. "Observe," Holmes said, tilting the book so I could see. "Weatherbe begins to record this sum, a full 20 guineas, but here the ink falters and the line ceases entirely." I frowned. Perhaps he was interrupted. "Indeed," Holmes said, "but by what? Or by whom?" He closed the ledger, replacing it carefully, then produced from his pocket a small envelope, ancient, crumpled, its wax seal partially torn. "This," he said, "was slipped between the pages." It bore only 2 words, hastily scrawled, "Confession enclosed," but the letter itself was missing. Ghosts, Watson, are notoriously poor archivists, Holmes said, tucking the envelope into his coat. And yet, here we have a ghost who knew exactly where to hide its sins. As we stepped out into the churchyard once more, I could not contain my curiosity. Holmes, I said, what do you make of it all? The ghost, the vanished warden, the lost confession. What do you truly believe happened in that vestry? Holmes gave me one of those smiles, the sort that barely lifts the corner of his mouth, yet speaks volumes. Belief, Watson, is a luxury I seldom indulge. I concern myself only with what can be known. And what do you know? Enough to proceed, he said, and no more. I was accustomed to such evasions by now, though I confess they never ceased to irritate me. Holmes had a gift, or a flaw, of keeping his most profound deductions under lock and key, until the precise moment they could be unveiled with the greatest dramatic effect. I suppose you'll tell me when it suits you, I muttered. Of course, Holmes replied. It's so much more satisfying that way. With that, he strode off toward the vicarage, leaving me trailing behind, notebook in hand, certain that Holmes's mind had already charted a course through the fog that obscured the ghost of St. Jude's. Holmes returned to the vestry that evening with a peculiar energy, his movements precise, his attention fixed upon the walls themselves rather than the floor or furniture. He traced his fingers along the panelling, pausing to rap his knuckles against the wood at intervals, the resulting hollow or solid notes seemingly charted in his mind like coordinates on a map. Do you notice, Watson, he said, after a prolonged silence, the curious manner in which sound carries in this room? I admitted I had not. He stooped by the floor, ear pressed to a narrow seam between the planks, and beckoned me to do the same. With some reluctance, I followed suit. And there, in the hush of the chapel, I caught it, a faint echo, as though air moved within the walls themselves. There, Holmes said softly, a speaking tube, ingenious in its simplicity, a relic from an earlier age when the vestry and the crypt below were connected. A whisper here becomes a ghost's voice there. The ingenuity was remarkable, though I confess the notion of such hidden conduits beneath a house of worship left me vaguely unsettled. The ghost has a throat, Watson, Holmes declared, rising to his feet. The only question now is, whose voice does it carry? With Holmes's discovery of the speaking tube, it became apparent that the ghostly voice had issued from somewhere beneath the chapel itself. The vestry floor was stone and timber, but a careful examination revealed a trapdoor, long overlooked and partially obscured by a wooden bench. The trapdoor led to a narrow flight of steps, damp with age and slick with moisture, descending into a sealed crypt, untouched for decades. The air hung heavy, the scent of earth and decay mingling unpleasantly with candle wax. Holmes's lanterns swept over the uneven stone walls, illuminating ancient burial niches, some marked with crumbling plaques, others sealed without inscription. His fingers brushed the dust from a particular stone slab, its surface slightly displaced. This, he said, is where our ghost found its stage. The speaking tube terminated directly above this slab. Whoever had whispered into it had stood in this crypt, invoking the warden's spirit from the very place his body should have rested. Graveyards do not speak of their own accord, Holmes said. They require a voice and a purpose. As we ascended back into the vestry, I could not shake the chill that clung to me. For all Holmes' scientific detachment, there was something profoundly unwholesome about a man using the very bones of the dead to terrify the living. The next morning, Holmes embarked upon a round of quiet inquiries, subtle conversations with the village postmaster, the landlady of the inn, and a few of the older parishioners who seemed all too willing to speak of past scandals. Through these fragmented accounts, a name emerged, Lady Margaret Vane. She was a wealthy widow who had retired to the village some years earlier. Her fascination with spiritualism was the subject of much gossip, seances held behind heavily curtained windows, mediums summoned from London, and countless hours spent wandering the churchyard at dusk. Lady Margaret, it seemed, had personal interest in the ghost of Elias Weatherbe. Rumour linked her family to the old scandal, a distant relation, perhaps even a suitor, involved in the warden's disgrace. Some believed she sought spiritual absolution for her family's past sins. Others whispered she merely craved attention and drama. Holmes' eyes gleamed at the mention of her name. A woman with a penchant for ghosts and a personal stake in the haunting, he said. Rarely do motives, means, and opportunity align so elegantly. Do you suspect her? I asked. Suspect? Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. I expect her. It was in the drawing room of the village inn that Holmes gently prized open the rest of Lady Margaret Vane's connection to the case. Through a casual word with the innkeeper, followed by a brief examination of the local genealogical register, he uncovered the truth. Elias Weatherbe, the vanished warden, was none other than Lady Margaret's distant cousin. It was a fact Lady Margaret had taken great pains to suppress, for the circumstances surrounding Weatherbe's disappearance had cast a permanent stain upon the family name. The whispers of theft had attached themselves not just to Weatherbe, but to all his kin. And in the brittle world of upper-class respectability, such scandals never truly die. She has spent her widowhood reconstructing her family's past, Holmes observed. But to restore a name once blackened, one must do more than polish the plaque. One must rewrite the story itself. The ghostly voice, it seemed, was part of that revision, though the precise purpose remained elusive. Holmes's gaze grew distant as he traced an invisible line between the vestry, the vanished warden, and the anxious lady whose past refused to remain buried. A woman battling both time and truth, Watson, Holmes said softly. It is a war she cannot win, but she may yet dictate how the tale is remembered. By midday, Holmes had drawn his first clear conclusion. Lady Margaret was not merely a fascinated onlooker, but the architect of the ghostly deception. Consider the sequence, Holmes explained as we walked back to the chapel. She inherits a disgrace, wrapped in family shame. She learns that the vestry, site of the scandal, possesses certain acoustic peculiarities. Armed with this knowledge and an unhealthy appetite for spiritual melodrama, she constructs a legendary haunting, a tale designed to both terrify and distract. Distract from what? I asked. That, said Holmes, is the question that remains. Despite this revelation, Holmes was peculiarly reserved, offering none of his usual flair for premature triumph. His deductions, though impressive, had only cleared the surface mist. There is more at stake here, Watson, he said. Lady Margaret's hand is evident, but the voice in the crypt was not hers alone. There is another player, one with motives rather more tangible than pride or legacy. He fell into silence, eyes narrowed in thought. I knew better than to press him. Holmes was following a thread into darkness, and until he reached its far end, his mind belonged entirely to the puzzle. That evening, over a modest supper at the inn, I made the mistake of asking Holmes for his full theory. His only reply was a smile so faint it was almost imperceptible. Come now, Holmes, I said. Surely you have pieced it all together. The speaking tube, the family disgrace, the manufactured haunting. What remains to be explained? He tapped his fingers idly against the table. I have found, Watson, that the most persistent ghosts are rarely the ones who appear in candlelight. They are the ghosts of motive and memory, the human phantoms who haunt their own crimes. I confess his vagueness irritated me. You mean to say there is another hand in this? Someone apart from Lady Margaret? Perhaps, Holmes said. Perhaps not. Ghosts have a habit of appearing in pairs, you know. It was the infuriating vagueness that I knew too well. Holmes dangling the truth just beyond my grasp, relishing my frustration as much as the mystery itself. Tomorrow night, he said, abruptly changing the subject, we shall hold a seance in the chapel. The Reverend will attend, as will Lady Margaret. And what do you expect to summon? I asked. Not a ghost, Holmes said. A man. With that enigmatic remark, Holmes retired early, leaving me with only fragments of his design. By the following morning, however, his plan was fully in motion. A message was dispatched to Reverend Netherby, requesting his presence at a midnight seance in the vestry. A second, far more delicately worded note was delivered to Lady Margaret, appealing to her spiritual sensibilities and inviting her to witness the next communication from beyond the veil. Holmes, meanwhile, occupied himself with preparations I could only describe as eccentric. Borrowing a length of twine from the innkeeper, requesting a full set of keys from the sexton, and spending a considerable portion of the afternoon in silent examination of the disturbed grave in the churchyard. "It is essential, Watson," he said, "that the players believe they are directing the play, when in fact they are merely following my script." I could endure his secrecy no longer. "Holmes," I demanded, "you owe me at least some fragment of your reasoning. Who is behind this? What is the true object of this charade?" Holmes gave me a look both fond and exasperated, as though I were a particularly slow pupil. "Patience, Watson. Tonight, the chapel will reveal its secrets, and its ghosts." Though I grumbled at his evasiveness, I knew from experience that the moment Holmes chose to unveil his conclusions would be a performance worth waiting for. That night, as we walked towards St. Jude's under a sky heavy with mist, Holmes's step was light, his mood positively buoyant, for nothing delighted him more than a game reaching its final move. It was with his customary air of unruffled authority that Holmes dispatched 2 invitations that afternoon, one to Reverend Netherby, the other to Lady Margaret Vane. Both letters, written in Holmes's firm and elegant hand, extended a most unusual summons. "A séance will be held tonight in the vestry of St. Jude's, where the spirit of Elias Weatherbe shall be invited to speak once more. Your presence, as those most affected by his fate, is earnestly requested." I read the draft over his shoulder and could not suppress my astonishment. "Holmes," I said, "you don't seriously propose to conduct a séance?" "Certainly not," he replied, "but it is important that they believe I do." "You are playing with fire," I warned. "Spiritualist nonsense aside, Lady Margaret's belief borders on obsession." "Exactly," said Holmes, "and obsession, Watson, is a most pliable material in the hands of one who knows how to shape it." He spoke no further, leaving me to marvel, as I often did, at the strange blend of cynical manipulation and scientific detachment that made up Sherlock Holmes. I could only hope that the ghost, or rather the ghost maker, would answer his invitation as predictably as his human calculations assumed. Holmes slipped the notes into envelopes, sealed them with a practiced press of his thumb, and handed them to me. "Tonight, Watson," he said, "we shall summon a ghost and unmask the man behind it." The vestry, by the time we returned that evening, had been transformed, though not by supernatural hands. Holmes had arranged the room with meticulous care, placing candles at precise intervals along the floor, their flames guttering in the damp air like sentinels guarding a secret. A single chair stood at the centre, reserved for the Reverend, while Lady Margaret was directed to a bench near the wall, her fingers clutching a folded handkerchief like a talisman against the unknown. Holmes himself took no seat, preferring to stand near the door, his eyes gleaming with theatrical anticipation. "Atmosphere is everything, Watson," he murmured as he adjusted the wick of the central candle. "A successful illusion requires the right stage, just as much as it does the right player." I could not deny the effect. Even I, a man of science, felt an involuntary shiver at the flicker of shadows along the ancient walls. The Reverend sat stiffly, his lips moving in silent prayer, while Lady Margaret's gaze flitted nervously between Holmes and the darkened corner where the speaking tube lay concealed. Holmes gave me a quick glance, a signal that all was prepared. "Now, Watson," he said softly, "let us summon the dead." Holmes extinguished all but one candle, plunging the vestry into a gloom so profound that every creak of timber and whisper of wind seemed charged with meaning. It was then, from the far wall, that the ghostly voice returned. "Charles Netherby." The sound was unmistakable. Thin, reedy, yet possessing a strange authority. It seemed to rise directly from the stones beneath our feet. Lady Margaret gave a small cry, clutching at the Reverend's sleeve, while Netherby himself sat frozen, sweat glistening on his brow. Holmes, however, moved with purpose, stepping directly to the wall and placing his hand upon the invisible seam where the speaking tube ended. He pressed his ear to the wood, then with a swift motion, lifted a candle to illuminate the spot. "Observe, Watson," he said calmly. "A ghost who requires physical ventilation, a most inconvenient necessity for a spirit." With a tug, he dislodged a small panel, revealing the narrow brass pipe, its edges worn with age. The voice faltered, then ceased altogether. "You see," Holmes said, turning to the others, "our phantom requires a very human accomplice to breathe life into his message. No spirit ever required a speaking tube, nor wore a clerical boot." He held up a fragment of waxed thread, caught in the panel's edge. "A voice was speaking to you, Reverend, but not from the beyond. Rather, from below." Lady Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, while the Reverend stammered, "But who could it be?" Holmes gave no answer, only a faint smile. "That," he said, "we shall discover very shortly." At Holmes's revelation, Lady Margaret's composure crumbled entirely. She slumped forward, her hands trembling, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "You knew," she whispered. "All along, you knew." Holmes's voice, though measured, was not unkind. "I knew, Lady Margaret, that someone wished to guide the Reverend's attention toward this chapel's unhappy history. I suspected you had a hand in it, though I doubted you had the necessary nerve to enact it alone." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "It was not meant to deceive him," she said. "I only wished to lead him to the truth, to clear my cousin's name, to let Elias rest in peace at last." Holmes's expression softened by a fraction. "I do not doubt your intent," he said, "but in your pursuit of redemption, you allowed yourself to become a pawn in someone else's game." "A pawn?" she echoed faintly. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "For while you desired only truth, there is another hand at work, one with far less noble motives." Lady Margaret covered her face with her hands, and the room fell silent, save for the crackle of the candle and the Reverend's whispered prayers. Holmes stepped back, his gaze resting not on Lady Margaret, but upon the trapdoor in the floor. "Watson," he said softly, "it is time we invited our ghost to explain himself." Holmes allowed the silence to stretch, the weight of his revelations settling over the vestry like a shroud. Lady Margaret's trembling, the Reverend's stunned confusion. All of it served as a carefully arranged stage upon which the final actor was about to appear. With deliberate calm, Holmes turned to the sexton, Mr. Abberline, who had lingered just beyond the threshold, half hidden in the gloom, no doubt summoned by his own guilty curiosity. "You've done admirable work over the years," Holmes remarked, his voice casual, "keeping the chapel clean of cobwebs and, where necessary, of inconvenient truths." The verger stiffened. His hands clenched the brim of his cap, twisting it into tortured shapes. "Do you truly believe," Holmes continued, "that after 30 years the earth would hold its tongue? That Elias Weatherbe's silence could be ensured by a few tricks of candlelight and sound?" The man's breath came faster, his eyes darting between Holmes and the floor. "I don't know what you mean, sir," he said, but the quaver in his voice betrayed him. Holmes took a single step closer. "It was you who operated the speaking tube, wasn't it? Whispering through the stones, guiding the Reverend toward a lie, just as you once helped bury the truth." Abberline collapsed onto the nearest bench, head in his hands. "I had to," he muttered. "They'd have dug it all up. The shame, the disgrace, they'd have ruined everything." "There is no ruin," Holmes said softly, "greater than a lie left to fester beneath holy ground." Without a word, Holmes led the shaken group out into the mist-laden churchyard. We followed him to the very stone he had examined earlier, a modest slab, its inscription half worn by time and weather. Holmes knelt, withdrawing a slender knife from his coat, and inserted it carefully along the edge of the stone. With a soft grating of earth and granite, the slab shifted, revealing a cavity concealed beneath. "Behold, Watson," Holmes said, "the confession of Elias Weatherbe." From the hollow, he withdrew a folded sheet of parchment, its edges stained with damp and soil, its ink faded but still legible beneath Holmes's lantern light. The Reverend gave a small cry, crossing himself, while Lady Margaret swayed as though the earth itself had betrayed her. Holmes unfolded the paper, reading aloud in his clear, unflinching voice. It was a letter written by Weatherbe himself, a final testament before his disappearance. In it, the old warden confessed not to theft, but to despair. He had been falsely accused, hounded by those who wished to cover their own embezzlement. Unable to clear his name, and fearful that the scandal would destroy the chapel itself, he had chosen to vanish rather than face public ruin. "This," said Holmes, "was the truth your ghost so desperately wished to tell." Lady Margaret sobbed quietly, and the Reverend stood pale and silent, caught between grief for a fellow servant of the cloth and awe at the machinery of deception built atop a single falsehood. Holmes handed the letter to the Reverend, who accepted it with reverent fingers. The weight of its words seemed to settle heavily upon him, as though the chapel itself leaned forward to listen. "So, the theft never happened?" I asked. "Precisely," Holmes said. "The true theft was the theft of reputation, the theft of a man's honour, stolen to shield the guilty." The letter revealed that Weatherbe had uncovered a small but systematic siphoning of church funds, carried out by none other than the verger himself, a much younger Aberline, who had then been entrusted with assisting in the collection and counting of donations. Weatherbe, a man of rigid morality, had confronted him. The confrontation led to accusation and counter-accusation, until Weatherbe realised his own spotless record would count for nothing against the whispers already circulating. His disappearance, painted as the flight of a guilty man, was in fact the retreat of an innocent one. But no one cared to correct the story. Aberline buried the truth along with the man, Holmes said. "But secrets, Watson, are rather like corpses. They have a most inconvenient habit of refusing to stay buried." The verger, still seated upon the bench, gave a small, broken sound, part sob, part sigh. "I only wanted it to end," he whispered. "I never meant to harm anyone." "Yet harm followed all the same," Holmes replied, "as it always does when truth is replaced by the convenient lie. I had assumed, wrongly as it turned out, that Lady Margaret had orchestrated the ghostly voice herself, but Holmes corrected me with evident satisfaction, explaining that Aberline was the true ghostmaker all along. "The good Lady Margaret," Holmes said, "merely supplied the belief. It was Aberline who supplied the voice." Holmes's inquiries had uncovered a curious fact. In the weeks leading up to the first ghostly visitation, Aberline had become increasingly desperate, fearing that Lady Margaret's incessant digging into the chapel's history would unearth the very secret he had concealed for decades. He knew her obsession would lead her to the vestry, Holmes said, and so he gave her exactly what she was looking for: a ghost who whispered only what Aberline wished her to know. The deception had been clever, but it could not account for Holmes's particular genius for peeling back artifice. Once the speaking tube was discovered, the rest fell into place like a game already lost before the first move. "The ghost," Holmes said, "was never real, but the guilt it sought to hide was all too tangible." Lady Margaret stared at Aberline, eyes wide with sorrow and disbelief, while the verger could not raise his head. Holmes merely dusted his hands and prepared for his final flourish. With the story laid bare, and the players stunned into silence, Holmes straightened his cuffs and gave one final performance. The explanation delivered with the precise flair of a magician pulling back the curtain on his grandest illusion. You see, Watson, he said, in matters of the supernatural, the human hand is never far behind. Ghosts are frightfully convenient, particularly when they can be trained to speak on cue. He turned to the Reverend. You have not been visited by the spirit of Elias Weatherbe, but by the combined hopes and fears of two souls, one who wished to rewrite history and another who wished it buried altogether. The Reverend murmured a prayer, while Lady Margaret, drained of all spirit herself, could only bow her head. Do you ever tire of such performances, Holmes? I asked as we walked back toward the inn. Never, said Holmes, for each case is merely a new stage upon which human nature performs its oldest tricks. The ghost of St. Jude's, my dear Watson, has taken its bow, and revealed itself to be nothing more than a man in the dark. It was a bleak afternoon when Holmes and I resumed our accustomed places at 221B Baker Street, the chill of Surrey clinging stubbornly to our coats. The fire crackled low in the grate, the familiar scent of pipe smoke and damp wool mingling with the faint odour of fog that had followed us in from the street. Holmes, settled in his usual posture, long limbs draped indolently across his chair, regarded the ceiling with a curious mixture of triumph and boredom, as though the case now completed had been an intellectual appetizer rather than the full repast his mind craved. As for myself, I was still grappling with the peculiar layers of deception that had led us from a trembling clergyman to a corrupted verger, by way of a ghost who spoke through stone. I had seen Holmes unravel many mysteries, but seldom one so tangled in human frailty, where guilt and grief had entwined so tightly that neither could be easily severed from the other. I trust, I said, that you will now satisfy my curiosity, for you have left me chasing your shadow throughout this affair. Holmes's smile was barely a flicker, his gaze still upon the ceiling. Very well, Watson, he said. Let us begin where all good ghosts do, with a candle, a hymnal, and a little dust. Holmes leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression that of a professor preparing to address an especially slow student. Do you recall, Watson, he said, the small candle scorch upon the vestry floor? Of course, I replied, though I fail to see its significance. Significance, my dear fellow, lies not in what is seen, but in what is moved. He gestured toward his own bookcase. That scorch mark was half obscured by a hymnal that had been carelessly replaced, and yet, what careless hand replaces a book so precisely as to cover exactly half a stain? I frowned, recalling the displaced hymnal. You mean it was deliberate? Quite so, said Holmes. Someone wished to partially conceal, not obliterate. A full concealment would draw no attention, but a partial one invites curiosity. Our ghostmaker was not merely covering tracks, he was leading us along them. I shook my head. But why leave such a clue? Because, Holmes said, the ghost required a stage. What is a haunting without an audience to haunt? The Reverend needed to find that scorch mark, that displaced book, all to confirm the ghost's presence in his own mind. He leaned back once more. A crude trick, but remarkably effective. For the mind willingly follows the path fear sets before it. And the dust? I asked. Holmes smiled. The dust told me something had recently disturbed a very old space, which led me to the crypt. Ghosts, you see, Watson, leave remarkably human footprints. Holmes rose and began pacing, always a sign that the internal machinery of his mind had found a rhythm too restless for sitting still. The speaking tube, Watson, he said, was the true throat of the ghost, an old feature of the chapel's construction, intended originally to allow communication between the vestry and the sexton's quarters below. He paused by the window, gazing out into the mist. It was a clever improvisation. Our ghostmaker repurposed this forgotten relic, using it to project a voice from the grave. Positioned within the crypt, his words rose through the very stone, echoing as though spoken by the dead themselves. I shuddered at the memory. It was unnerving, I admitted. Precisely the intention, said Holmes. and by keeping his voice at a whisper, he ensured that the imagination filled the gaps far more effectively than any elaborate apparition could have managed. He turned back toward me, his expression now sharp with satisfaction. The ghost, you see, was never intended to answer questions, only to ask them. Its role was to guide the Reverend's suspicion to a precise place: the vestry, the gravestone, the ledger. And yet, I said, the ghost spoke only when it served its creator's interest. Exactly, said Holmes. A spirit bound not by heaven or hell, but by the guilty conscience of a living man. Holmes returned to his chair, folding himself into it with the air of a man who has earned his repose. The ledger, he said, was the single most damning clue, not for what it contained, but for what it had lost. I recalled the torn page, the abrupt interruption in Weatherbe's own hand. It was unfinished, I said. Precisely, said Holmes. And that alone told us Weatherbe's final act was interrupted by something, or someone. Holmes produced the crumpled envelope, retrieved from the ledger's spine. A confession, he said, or rather, the promise of one. It was addressed to the bishop's office, but never delivered. Its contents, the truth Weatherbe intended to reveal, were removed before the letter was hidden. What remained was an empty husk, a skeleton of guilt with its heart cut out. I considered this. So Abeline intercepted it? Unquestionably, Holmes said. The verger, young and foolish at the time, realized that if Weatherbe's letter saw the light of day, his own petty theft would become known. And so, rather than allow the truth to emerge, he buried both the letter and the man who wrote it. He tapped the envelope against his palm. And yet, Holmes said, even the most carefully buried truths have a way of scratching at their coffin lids. And the ghost? I asked. Ah, the ghost. Holmes smiled. The ghost was merely the voice of Weatherbe's unfinished story. Resurrected not by the spirit world, but by the fear of a guilty man realizing his secret had begun to stir. Holmes drew his knees up in his chair, his fingertips pressed together in that characteristic pose which always signified the closing argument of his reasoning. Lady Margaret, he began, was not a schemer, Watson. She was a believer, and therein lay her undoing. I glanced toward him, puzzled. But if she believed the ghost was real, how could she have played a part in the deception? She did not invent the ghost, Holmes explained, but she invited it into existence through her own obsession. From the moment she inherited her family's connection to St. Jude's, she set her mind upon the idea that the chapel held some unquiet spirit, a spirit tied to her disgraced cousin, Elias Weatherbe. He stood and paced the room slowly. Abeline did not need to persuade her to believe. She arrived already prepared to accept the supernatural at face value. All he needed was to feed that belief, with a whisper, a flicker of candlelight, a misplaced book. Every piece of the haunting was designed not to convince a skeptic, but to confirm the expectations of a devotee. I shook my head. It's remarkable how easily belief can become a prison. Remarkable? Holmes raised an eyebrow. It is the most natural thing in the world. Once the mind embraces a comforting fiction, it fights to preserve it, even when the truth stands clear before it. He allowed himself a thin smile. Lady Margaret's belief was the perfect instrument for the crime. Abeline did not have to fabricate her obsession. He only had to stage manage it. Holmes resumed his seat and reached for his pipe, tapping the bowl against the mantelpiece as though knocking loose the final pieces of the puzzle. Abeline's role, he said, was not born of malice, but of fear, the fear that his youthful crime would one day crawl from its grave. I recalled the man's trembling confession in the chapel, the way his voice had cracked beneath the weight of Holmes's deductions. For 30 years, Holmes continued, he lived in the shadow of a missing man's silence, knowing that, should the truth of Weatherbe's fate ever come to light, his own part in the theft would be dragged into daylight alongside it. He lit his pipe and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. So, When Lady Margaret began her archaeology of family shame, Abberline realized the ghost, his old secret, would not lie still. Thus, he conceived the haunting, not merely to frighten the Reverend, but to control the story. If he could guide suspicion towards some convenient supernatural explanation, then the earthly truth might remain buried. But, I protested, the theft was imagined. Weatherbe was innocent. Precisely, said Holmes. Abberline covered a crime that never existed, only to commit a greater one in its place, the theft of a man's reputation, and then of his resting peace. He gave a slight shrug. It is the nature of guilt, Watson. It builds its own scaffolding of lies, long after justice has ceased to care. I could remain silent no longer. Holmes, I said, do you feel nothing for these people? A good man's name destroyed, a woman driven to hysterical belief, and a servant crushed beneath his own guilt. Does none of this move you? Holmes glanced at me, his expression unreadable. It moves me, Watson, to the extent that any well-constructed mechanism inspires admiration. But you are mistaken if you think my profession is concerned with sentiment. He rose, brushing ash from his sleeve. I have often told you, my business is knowledge, not compassion. Sentiment clouds judgment, and judgment is the only currency worth spending in our line of work. I exhaled sharply, half expecting such a response, and yet unable to suppress my frustration. There are times, Holmes, I said, when I wonder if you have a human heart at all. He smiled faintly. If I do, Watson, it beats purely in rhythm with the pursuit of truth. For a time, Holmes said nothing. The fire crackled softly, and the muffled sounds of Baker Street drifted through the window, the clatter of carriage wheels, the distant cry of a costermonger. Then, quite unexpectedly, Holmes spoke. There was a moment, Watson, he said, when even I wondered. I started. Wondered? About what? Whether something truly spectral had touched that chapel, he said. It is an uncomfortable admission, but for the briefest instant, I entertained the notion that reason might fail before the unexplained. I stared at him, astonished. And what banished that thought? Holmes gave his most sardonic smile. A footprint, my dear Watson. Ghosts rarely leave mud from the vestry garden upon the floor. He turned back to the fire, his voice dropping to a murmur. But the mind is a curious instrument. Even the most logical of us can find, in the right light and at the right hour, that reason stands upon a trembling threshold. And with that, he fell into silence, leaving me to ponder whether the ghost of St. Jude's had indeed visited us all. Not in spirit, but in the flicker of doubt that haunts even the keenest intellect. As the case at St. Jude's drew to its inevitable conclusion, I found myself reflecting on the peculiar blend of human frailty and deception that had underpinned the mystery. A ghostly ruse, concocted not from the supernatural, but from the all-too-human emotions of greed, guilt, and misguided belief. It had taken little more than a whisper, a shadow, and a lady's desperate yearning for answers to create a tale that could stand as a monument to human folly. Lady Margaret, in her pursuit of truth, had woven herself a web of illusion so thick that even the sharpest mind, at least initially, had found itself entangled within it. It struck me, with an almost sad irony, how easily truth and falsehood could blend in the shadows of belief. A simple candle flame, the creak of an ancient floorboard, and suddenly, reality became whatever one's mind most wanted it to be. Holmes, of course, had seen through it all, piecing together the clues with his customary detachment and precision. To him, it was just another puzzle to solve, another mystery to be dissected. But I found myself still pondering the greater implications of the case. How much of our world is shaped by what we choose to believe and what we choose to ignore? While I mused on such questions, Holmes was already immersed in his own peculiar world. His mind had entirely discarded the drama of the seance, the supernatural elements, and even the human emotions that had driven the players of this tragedy. He sat comfortably in his chair, unfazed by the psychological intricacies we had just unravelled, with a monograph on Victorian funeral customs open before him. "There is more to be learned from the manner in which death is handled, Watson," he remarked, without so much as looking up, "than from all the philosophical musings on life itself." His voice held no trace of humour, only a detached fascination. After all, how we die says far more about us than how we live. I could only shake my head, bemused at his utter indifference to the human tragedy we had just witnessed. For Holmes, it seemed, the only thing worth contemplating was the intellectual precision of how one arranged death, not its emotional cost. As Holmes continued his monograph, I took the opportunity to press him for a final word on the ghostly matters we had dealt with. "So, Holmes," I ventured, "do you now believe that spirits can walk among us?" He glanced up at me for a moment, his lips curling into the faintest smile. "Spirits? No, Watson. Ghosts are merely people in clever disguises, their motives all too earthly. If you wish to understand what drives men to such actions, look to their greed, their fear, or their guilt. Never to the afterlife. It is the living who haunt us, not the dead." Holmes leaned back, his hands steepled in front of him, as though conducting an invisible symphony. "The dead do not speak, Watson. It is we, the living, who insist on giving them voices. But in the end, it is our own weaknesses and desires that guide us, not the spirits of the past." As the evening wore on, the ticking of the clock seemed louder, more urgent, in the quiet of our shared space. The mystery of St. Jude's had been laid to rest, and with it, the echoes of the chapel's haunting had faded into memory. But the world, as always, had more mysteries in store. At the stroke of midnight, the doorbell rang, cutting through the stillness of the night like a herald's call. I opened the door to find a telegram, freshly delivered, bearing the unmistakable seal of Buckingham Palace. Holmes took the paper with a glance of curiosity. "A missing sapphire, Watson? At Buckingham Palace?" He raised an eyebrow. "Now this promises to be more interesting than the ghost of a long-dead churchwarden, I dare say." I stared at the telegram, my interest piqued. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" His lips quirked in that familiar, calculating smile. "I think, Watson, that we are about to be entangled in yet another complicated web of intrigue." He paused, dropping the telegram to the side. "But first, we must deal with our old friend, the world of human nature, which never ceases to amaze." And so, with one last glance at the flickering firelight, we turned our attention to the next case, the new sapphire mystery waiting to unfold. As we sat in the familiar comfort of 221B Baker Street, the faint glow of the gas lamps casting long shadows across the room, Holmes placed his fingertips together, his gaze distant but sharp. He seemed lost in thought, as though the case we had just concluded was not the only matter occupying his mind. "You see, Watson," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. "The problem was never the ghost nor the chapel. It was the mind that sought to believe in things unseen, simply to find comfort in a truth that was more pleasant than the real one." I nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling upon me. "So, it was all a matter of self-deception then?" "Exactly. In the end, belief can be as dangerous as any lie. When we choose to see things that aren't there, we leave ourselves vulnerable to those who would take advantage of our need for answers." He leaned forward, his piercing eyes meeting mine. "And that, Watson, is where the true ghosts lie. Not in the supernatural, but in the fragility of the human mind." I sat back in my chair, contemplating the lesson hidden beneath the layers of this case, the danger of unchecked belief, the ease with which the mind could be manipulated. But then, as if Holmes were reading my thoughts, he turned to me with a slight smirk. "Now, Watson, I leave this mystery for our friends at home. What do you think was the culprit's biggest mistake in this case? Was it the over-reliance on a fabricated ghost? Or perhaps the way truth was buried beneath layers of lies? Think carefully, my friend, and see if you can uncover what I have overlooked. Holmes settled back into his chair, content as I pondered the question. But before I could speak, he added with a knowing smile, "And if you've enjoyed this mystery, Watson, I'd suggest our viewers share their thoughts in the comments below. Perhaps they've solved the puzzle even faster than we have. Remember, it's always the keen-eyed observer who spots the tiniest details that make all the difference." He glanced at the clock. "And if they'd like to follow our further investigations, I suggest they subscribe for more adventures, because the game, as they say, is always afoot."